I was born in the United States, but I lived in Japan for many years. My business in Asia did well, and I became rich. After 20 years, I decided to visit my home in New York. On my way from Japan to New York, I stayed in Chicago for a week. I had a friend who lived in San Francisco, and I wanted to see him again. His name was Harry Watson, and he had been my friend for many years. We had written many letters to each other, but lately I'd not received any news from him. Harry never had a job. His father gave him a little money, and so he had never worked. Harry was very superstitious. He thought that luck or magic could change things in his life. He spent most of his time reading strange books. Most of the books were about philosophy, which I called magic books. As soon as I arrived in San Francisco, I sent a message to Harry's house. The message said, "I am staying in San Francisco for 4 days. Can I visit you?" Harry surprised me. An hour later, he sent a servant to my hotel with a reply. Harry wrote,
"Come to my house at once, my dear friend. Come this evening. You will remember the house, I'm sure. It was my father's home. I live in a tower at one end of the house. You don't have to ring the bell or knock on the door. I'll tell the servants to go to bed, and I'll leave the front door of the tower open. Come up the stairs immediately. I'll be waiting for you. Please come soon."
I went in a taxi to Harry's house. That night, the weather was stormy. I had forgotten that Chicago is cold and wet in winter. Harry's house was an ugly 2-story building made of bricks with a tower at one end. The house had a garden with many trees and beautiful plants, but now it was winter, and there were no leaves on the trees or flowers on the plants. The driver stopped his taxi near the tower. Even though the front door was closed, I got soaked with rain as soon as I stepped out of the taxi. I ran to the door of the tower and turned the handle. The door was unlocked, so I opened it. There was a small lamp on the stairway that gave off a little light, but not much. The hall was full of shadows, and I couldn't see clearly. I climbed the stairs slowly, using my fingers to guide me along the wall. At the top of the stairs, there was another door. I opened it and entered a room lit by another small lamp. Harry came forward, shook my hand, and held it. He was wearing a long silk coat and soft leather slippers. His clothes were strange. We looked at each other, and I was shocked. I had not seen Harry for many years. My friend had changed a lot. He used to be a handsome man, but now his hair was white, and his face was very pale. There were many lines around his eyes and mouth. Harry looked like a thin old man, even though he wasn't older than 50. His large, bright eyes shone strangely in the shadowy room.
"Welcome, my friend. Please sit down."
Harry said. He offered me some wine and a cigar, and we talked a little, but our conversation wasn't very interesting. Meeting friends after many years can be difficult, and it can make you sad. Maybe Harry guessed what I was thinking.
Non sum qualis eram. I'm not as I was,
he said. I tried to make a joke and said, Your Latin hasn't improved. My friend smiled.
Latin is a dead language, and I'm a dead man,
He said. Then his smile disappeared, and he added,
I will die very soon.
I didn't know what to say. I smoked my cigar and drank my wine. Both of us remained quiet for a few minutes. The wind had stopped blowing outside, and I wanted to leave the house. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was not quick or loud. It was not the sound of someone knocking loudly on a door. The soft tapping sounded like someone sending a signal or a message. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay or leave? I stood up and said, I see that you are very tired. I'll leave now. May I visit you tomorrow? Harry turned his head, looked at me, and said,
Please don't leave me. There's no problem. Nobody is there.
He walked to a small window and opened it. I hadn't noticed the window before.
Look,
He said. I walked across the room and looked out of the window. I could see nothing except the light of a street lamp and the rain falling.
please don't leave me. I must tell you a story. You're the only person I can tell it to. Will you listen to my story?
Harry asked. Very well. I'll stay and listen, I said. Harry poured me another drink and offered me another cigar. Then he began to tell his story.
I didn't move into this house until my father died. That was 10 years ago, when I was about 40 years old. When my father passed away, I got his business, his property, and his money. Before his death, I lived in a large apartment building on Nob Hill. Maybe you know that area of San Francisco. Nob Hill was a fashionable area 40 years ago, but now it's run down and neglected. The owner of the apartment building rented out many of its small rooms. The walls of the rooms were so thin that you could almost put your hand through them. I was lucky. The rent was cheap, and I had a large room in the building. No one visited me, and no one disturbed me. I could read my books quietly. I lived happily on Nob Hill. One morning, as I was leaving the apartment, I saw a young girl. It was a cold day in March. She was wearing a black coat and a white straw hat. Then I saw her face. It's hard to describe. It was strange and beautiful. I had never seen such a beautiful face before. Without thinking, I lifted my hat and bowed. She looked at me with bright blue eyes, but she didn't speak. I could tell she was happy to see me, but she didn't smile. She went into the house and shut the door. I stood there, staring at the closed door. Would I see her again? Should I speak to her? Would she speak to me? Perhaps you think these are the thoughts of a much younger man, and maybe you're right, but these feelings were new to me. I had never been in love before. I had spent too many years with books and too little time with people. Now, I believe you're my only friend. Soon, none of this will matter. I don't feel foolish when I talk to you.
Harry stopped speaking for a minute, then continued with his story.
The next day, I waited in my apartment. For hours, I looked out of the window, watching the street, but the girl didn't come out of the building. I didn't know her name, so I couldn't ask anyone about her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I sat by the window again and waited. Then suddenly, she came out of the apartment building, and I went out too. But by the time I reached the street, she had disappeared. I couldn't see where she had gone, so I walked around the neighborhood. At last, I saw her in a narrow street. We smiled at each other. She recognized me, I'm sure of that. After that, I often went out when she did. She always wore that white straw hat. I didn't follow her. I just walked around the neighborhood, hoping to see her again. At last, I went to the landlady of the apartment. "Who is the girl with the pretty face and the straw hat?" I asked her.
She's my niece, sir. She's a servant in this house. She lives here because her parents are dead. She works for me. She cooks, cleans the building, and also buys our food. She lives at the top of the house. Her room is next to yours, but at the top of the other staircase.
The landlady replied, "Oh, my friend, I wish I had never heard that piece of information."
Harry said to me.
The girl's room was next to mine. She was just on the other side of the thin wall. At night, I would put my hand on the wall and think of her. Was her bed against the wall? Was she sleeping only a few inches from my hand? I couldn't read because of the girl. My mind wasn't clear. I only thought about her and could not focus on my books about philosophy.
Harry continued.
I had never wanted to marry. I had no interest in having a wife and children. I only wanted to study and learn. I could never marry a poor, uneducated servant girl. My father would never have given his permission. All my money came from him. If he had stopped supporting me, well,
What happened next? I asked. Harry looked at me sadly.
I stopped waiting for her and watching her. I focused only on my studies and spent all my time reading my books. But one cold night, I couldn't sleep. I just couldn't stop thinking about the beautiful girl. I wanted to be with her. She was only on the other side of the wall. I tapped on the wall very gently 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. I tapped again. Tap, tap, tap. Then I felt like a fool. I was acting like a boy in love for the first time. I got out of bed and began to study my books. I was reading a strange book. It was a book on philosophy. You might call it a book of magic and superstition. In this book, author describes how to be a fortune teller and also writes about strange and terrible things that happen 3 times. When these things happen 3 times, death would follow. The author called this a fatal death. I believe that fatal death has happened to me.
Why? What happened? I asked.
While I was alone, reading that strange book, I heard a sound. It was a soft tapping coming from beyond the wall. It was the answer to my own signal. Tap, tap, tap. I knew the pretty servant girl was sending a message to me, asking me to come to her. I ran to the wall and tapped my signal again. Tap, tap, tap. But after that, there was only silence. She didn't reply to any of my other signals. I listened for many hours, but I heard nothing. For many days after that, I looked for the girl, but I never saw her again. I tried to forget her. Then, one evening, I went to bed early because I was very tired. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. I had heard a soft sound. I opened my eyes and sat up. I heard a gentle tapping on the wall beside the bed. A few moments later, I heard the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. I was about to reply to the signal, but then I stopped. The girl had not replied to my last messages, so I decided I wouldn't answer hers now.
Harry took a sip of wine and then continued.
I lay in bed listening, but I didn't reply. At last, I must have slept. When I woke up, it was late and I felt tired. I needed some fresh air, so I went out of my apartment. The landlady was outside my door and said,
"Oh, Mr. Harry, have you heard the terrible news?"
My heart began to beat quickly, and my voice trembled when I answered. What news? I asked her.
"My poor niece was sick for a week. You didn't know? I've seen you watching her. Didn't you know she was ill?"
The landlady asked. I was shocked. I didn't know what to say. Yes, I had looked at the girl, but I'd never spoken to her. My mind was always full of thoughts of my books and thoughts of her. How much time had passed since I last saw her? A few days? A week? I couldn't remember. And how is your niece now? I asked the landlady.
"I'm sorry, sir. Last night she was very sick, and I took care of her. The poor girl had only one request. She wanted her bed to be moved beside the wall next to your room. So we moved her bed. This made her feel happier, poor thing. Then she touched the wall and smiled. A few hours later, she died."
The expression on Harry's face was terrible. There were tears in his eyes as he continued his story.
When I heard this news, I nearly died too. I didn't know what to say. What had I done? I had sent my thoughts to the girl, and she had answered. I hadn't called out with words. I had used philosophy, magic to send her a message.
Harry stopped speaking for a few minutes. Then he continued.
A few days later, I heard of my father's death. I left the apartment on Nob Hill and came to this house. It's been my home since then. I've been waiting here, in this tower, for 10 years, waiting for a visitor. I wasn't expecting you, but your visit wasn't a surprise. Philosophy tells us that signs are repeated 3 times. You've heard my story. You must decide if it fits the idea of a fatal death. I heard the tapping twice before. The first time, I tried to find the person who made the sound. The second time, many signals were sent to me, but I didn't answer. Now you've heard the tapping too. That makes the third time. The fatal death is complete.
I stood up and shook Harry's hand. My friend knew that I understood his pain and sadness. He pressed my hand with his fingers and smiled. I said good night. There was nothing more to say. The next morning, a servant from Harry Watson's house came to me with the sad news. My friend Harry had died in the night.